In forgotten places where the wind carries memory, where silence watches quietly, justice does not shout, it whispers, and every act leaves an echo. This is Whispers of Reckoning. The factory siren had shaped the town for 3 generations. Every morning at 6. The same metallic cry rolling across Redwood Hollow. A sound so familiar that most people no longer heard it consciously. It simply existed. Like gravity. Like sunrise. Like the certainty that the day ahead would resemble the one before it. For 73 years the siren meant work. And work meant stability. Not wealth. Not luxury. But predictability. The kind that lets people sleep through the night without wondering what tomorrow will cost. Redwood Hollow had grown around that rhythm. The grocery store opened at 5:30. The diner began pouring coffee at 5. Children learned to wake before the second siren sounded. Every life in town moved according to that single industrial heartbeat. Until the morning the siren never came. The silence that replaced it spread slowly at first. People woke anyway. Habit is stronger than alarm clocks. Lights flicked on inside small houses. Coffee brewed. Doors opened. But something felt wrong immediately. The air lacked its usual vibration. The factory yard remained dark. The smokestacks released no steam. Within minutes the phones began ringing. Neighbors calling neighbors. Managers calling supervisors. Rumors moving faster than truth. By 8 o'clock the town knew. The company had closed overnight. No warning. No transition period. Just a notice posted to the factory gate. Production terminated. Operations relocated overseas. Employees thanked for their service. Security guards already stationed at the entrance. 300 people stood outside the locked gates that morning. Some angry. Some confused. Some simply quiet. The town did not collapse immediately. Communities rarely do. Collapse begins slowly. Like frost forming along the edges of glass. First came uncertainty. The grocery store owner shortened inventory orders. The diner reduced staff hours. The bank manager began reviewing loan accounts more carefully. Within weeks the changes became visible. Store windows displayed fewer goods. Streetlights dimmed earlier at night. Conversations in public spaces grew shorter. Polite. Guarded. Scarcity had entered Redwood Hollow. And scarcity always rearranges people. The town had never been wealthy. But it had always been stable. Stability allows generosity. Scarcity introduces calculation. Neighbors who once shared tools began locking their garages. Parents watched expenses more closely. The diner removed. Free refills. Small adjustments. Practical decisions. No one blamed anyone. But the tone of the town shifted. Not hostile. Just careful. Careful people survive longer in uncertain times. But carefulness has a cost. Kindness becomes a luxury. And luxury disappears quickly when survival enters the conversation. Mara Ellison noticed the change before most people. Bakers always notice early. Bread reflects a town's condition faster than statistics ever will. When people feel secure, they buy fresh bread daily. When uncertainty grows, they stretch loaves longer. They purchase smaller portions. Or none at all. Mara had run the bakery on Main Street for 22 years. Her parents had opened it before her. The small brick building sat halfway down the block between the diner and the hardware store. Not large. But dependable. The smell of warm bread drifting through the street had become part of Redwood Hollow's identity. For decades the bakery had been busy. Morning rush. Lunch traffic. Evening customers carrying bread home for dinner. 3 weeks after the factory closed, the morning rush disappeared. Customers still came. But fewer. And quieter. People studied prices longer. Bought one loaf instead of two. Sometimes none. Mara adjusted recipes carefully. Less waste. Smaller batches. She kept the ovens running. But the margins tightened every day. Flour cost more now. Sugar shipments had become irregular. She recalculated expenses every night before closing. Always arriving at the same conclusion. The bakery could survive a few months. Maybe longer. If nothing else changed. But if the town's decline accelerated. Even dependable businesses eventually run out of air. Mara tried not to think about that. Bakers learn patience. Dough requires time. Heat requires attention. And panic ruins both. She focused on the daily rhythm instead. Mix, knead. Wait. Bake. Serve. Small routines create stability even when the world outside begins shifting. The afternoon the stranger arrived had been particularly slow. 2 customers all morning. 3 during lunch. By 4 o'clock the bakery stood nearly empty. Sunlight slanted through the front windows. Dust particles drifted above the wooden counter. 3 loaves remained on the display shelf. Fresh. Golden. Still warm. Mara had calculated carefully. Those loaves represented tomorrow's flour order. If they sold. She wiped her hands on a cloth and began cleaning the mixer. The bell above the door rang softly. A man stepped inside. His coat looked thin for early winter. Boots worn. Not ragged. Just tired. He stood quietly near the entrance. Eyes adjusting to the warm light. Mara noticed immediately that he was not from Redwood Hollow. Small towns recognize unfamiliar faces quickly. Travelers passed through occasionally. But strangers rarely lingered. The man approached the counter slowly. "I'm sorry to ask," he said. His voice carried the calm tone of someone accustomed to rejection. "I don't have money today." Mara waited. "I haven't eaten." The words hung between them. Not dramatic. Just honest. She glanced at the bread shelf. 3 loaves. Tomorrow's margin. The arithmetic appeared instantly in her mind. Flour inventory. Weekly expenses. The bakery's fragile balance. Redwood Hollow had begun protecting itself. Everyone had. That was how communities survived downturns. Resources tightened. Doors closed earlier. People took care of their own first. No one would blame her for refusing. Refusal had become normal. Practical. Expected. The man did not plead. He simply waited. Hands resting loosely on the counter. Not aggressive. Not embarrassed. Just patient. Mara studied his hands. They trembled slightly. Not from anger. From exhaustion. She reached behind the counter and lifted one loaf. Then paused. Something about the silence in the bakery felt heavier than the bread itself. The town had been shrinking inward for weeks. Every decision reinforcing that movement. Protection. Calculation. Withdrawal. She lifted a second loaf. Then broke one in half. Wrapped the pieces carefully in paper. And placed them on the counter. The man looked surprised. "Why?" he asked quietly. The answer arrived before she had time to reconsider it. "Because I still can." The stranger held her gaze a moment longer than expected. Not gratitude. Recognition. Then he nodded once. "Redwood Hollow remembers," he said softly. Before Mara could ask what he meant, the door bell rang again as he stepped outside. The bakery returned to silence. But the room felt slightly different. Not fuller. Not emptier. Balanced. Mara watched the door for several seconds. Then returned to cleaning the mixer. The arithmetic still existed. Flour still cost money. 3 loaves had become 2. But something inside the room had shifted. Small. Almost invisible. Yet real. Like the moment dough begins to rise. You cannot see the change immediately. But the process has already begun. The bakery returned to quiet after the stranger left. For several minutes Mara continued cleaning the mixer. She moved slowly. Methodically. But her thoughts had drifted elsewhere. The town had changed since the factory closed. Not dramatically. But noticeably. Redwood Hollow had always been friendly. People greeted each other on sidewalks. Neighbors helped shovel snow. The diner kept a small chalkboard listing unpaid meals that anyone could settle later. Small towns survived through cooperation. But scarcity had begun tightening those threads. Mara had watched it happen day by day. People spoke less. Smiled less. Protected more. The stranger had asked for bread during that moment of contraction. And something inside her had resisted the instinct to close. She wrapped the remaining loaf and placed it on the shelf. 2 loaves left. Still enough. For now. The evening passed quietly. The bakery closed at 6. Mara swept the floor. Turned off the ovens. Then stepped outside onto Main Street. Redwood Hollow looked smaller after sunset. Streetlights glowed dimmer these days. Electric bills mattered now. Across the street the diner sign flickered softly. A few regulars sat inside drinking coffee. The grocery store lights shut off early. The owner had begun reducing hours. Mara locked the bakery door and walked home. Nothing dramatic had changed. Yet something subtle felt different in the air. Like the moment before a storm shifts direction. The next morning the bakery opened at 5:30. Habit had kept that schedule alive even after the factory closed. Fewer people arrived now. But routine still mattered. Mara placed fresh bread on the shelves and brewed coffee for early customers. At 6:15 the bell above the door rang. Mrs. Donnelly entered carrying her usual handbag. She had lived in Redwood Hollow longer than anyone could remember. Her husband had worked at the factory for 40 years before retiring. She approached the counter and studied the bread display. "How many today?" Mara asked. 2, Mrs. Donnelly said. Then she hesitated. "And 1 more." Mara reached for 3 loaves. Mrs. Donnelly placed money on the counter. "Enough for 3. Then she slid 1 loaf back across the wood surface. "I won't need that one," she said casually. "Someone else might." Mara raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Donnelly smiled faintly. "Just leave it there." The doorbell rang again as she left. Mara stared at the extra loaf for several seconds. It sat alone on the shelf. Wrapped in paper. Waiting. The morning continued slowly. 2 construction workers entered for coffee. One bought a loaf of bread. The other noticed the extra loaf sitting on the shelf. "What's that for?" he asked. "Someone left it," Mara replied. "For anyone who needs it." The worker shrugged. "That's new." He left without taking it. But 20 minutes later a young mother entered the bakery. Her child clung to her coat sleeve. The woman studied the bread prices carefully. Mara recognized the expression. The same arithmetic she had done herself the night before. The woman finally selected a small roll. Just 1. Then noticed the wrapped loaf on the shelf. "What's that?" she asked. "Someone paid for it already." The woman hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Yes." She lifted the loaf carefully. As if afraid the offer might vanish if she moved too quickly. Thank you, she said quietly. Then she left. The bakery felt warmer afterward. Not physically. Emotionally. By noon the small change had begun spreading. Across the street the diner filled with workers discussing job searches and unemployment paperwork. One man finished his meal and left money on the counter. Keep the change, he told the waitress. For whoever comes in next. The waitress frowned. Are you sure? Yeah. She placed the extra cash beneath the register. 20 minutes later another customer sat down. Ordered coffee. Looked tired. The waitress refilled his cup and slid the register receipt across the counter. No charge today, she said. The man looked confused. Someone already covered it. He stared at the coffee. Then nodded slowly. All right. Outside the diner window the town continued its cautious routine. But the mood felt slightly lighter. Mara noticed the difference before evening. Customers lingered longer inside the bakery. Conversation returned. Small talk about weather and road conditions. Nothing dramatic. Just normal. The extra loaf disappeared before closing. Another customer quietly paid for one to replace it. By the end of the day 2 loaves sat on the shelf labeled the same way. For whoever needs it. Mara closed the bakery that night feeling something she had not felt since the factory closed. Momentum. Not financial momentum. Something more subtle. The town had begun moving again. Outward. Instead of inward. 3 days later Mara discovered the coin. It appeared inside the bakery tip jar sometime during the afternoon. She noticed it while counting change before closing. The coin did not resemble modern currency. The metal looked darker. Heavier. Worn smooth along the edges. She turned it beneath the counter light. One side contained no writing. Just the faint image of a spiral. The engraving looked old. Ancient almost. But precise. The same inward curve tightening toward a small center point. The symbol felt strangely familiar. Mara ran her thumb across the surface. The metal held warmth. As if it had just come from someone's hand. Yet the bakery had been nearly empty that afternoon. She looked toward the door instinctively. The street outside remained quiet. No stranger waited there. Still, the presence of the coin unsettled her thoughts. It did not feel random. It felt placed. Like a marker. The stranger returned the following evening. The bakery bell rang just before closing. Mara looked up from the register. He stepped inside calmly. The same thin coat. The same steady eyes. But his posture looked stronger now. Less exhausted. I found work, he said. Temporary construction. He placed money on the counter. Enough for 3 loaves. Mara wrapped them. The stranger took one. Then pushed 2 back toward her. For someone else, he said. Mara studied him carefully. You weren't desperate the other day. The man tilted his head slightly. No, you were watching. Listening. To what? The stranger glanced around the bakery. At the shelves. At the tip jar where the spiral coin rested among smaller change. To pressure. Mara frowned. That doesn't sound like hunger. It isn't. He picked up the coin briefly. Then set it back down. Small towns carry pressure differently than cities. How? They remember. Mara crossed her arms. You said that before. Yes. And what does it mean? The stranger looked toward the window where evening sunlight touched the empty street. Communities mirror what they receive. If fear spreads, fear multiplies. If generosity appears, generosity multiplies. Mara leaned against the counter. You think a loaf of bread started all this? No, you think the town already wanted to change? The stranger smiled faintly. Alignment rarely begins with the largest action. It begins with the first one. He lifted his loaf of bread. Pressure moves through people the same way it moves through weather. Eventually something shifts. The bakery door opened again as a customer entered behind him. Mara looked up briefly. When she turned back, the stranger had already stepped outside. The coin remained in the tip jar, the spiral catching the fading light. By the end of the week the change in Redwood Hollow became visible. Not dramatic. Not revolutionary. Just noticeable. The town moved differently. People walked slower along Main Street. They stopped speaking to one another instead of passing silently. Doors remained open slightly longer in the evening. And the bakery shelf continued holding one extra loaf each morning. Sometimes two. Sometimes none. No one discussed it formally. No town meeting. No announcement. But word traveled the way small-town information always does. Quietly. Organically. Someone paid for bread ahead of time. Someone covered coffee for a stranger. Someone left an envelope at the grocery counter with $20 and no name attached. Small actions. But repetition builds pattern. And patterns reshape behavior. The diner noticed the change first. By the following Monday the chalkboard behind the counter carried a new message written in blue marker. Community coffee, already paid. Below it a list of names appeared. Not donors. Recipients. People who had quietly accepted a free meal during the past few days. The list was short. Only 4 names. But the presence of the board changed something. Customers began asking the waitress about it. Who started that? She shrugged. Someone paid for a few extra meals. The next morning another name appeared beneath the first 4. By evening 2 more followed. Still small. Still manageable. But visible. Across the street the hardware store owner adjusted his policies as well. For years he had operated strictly on cash sales. No credit. No exceptions. Hardware margins rarely allowed generosity. But after watching the bakery shelf and the diner board for several days he placed a small note near the register. Short-term repairs, payment later. He did not advertise it widely. Just left the note there. A quiet option. Within hours the town mechanic arrived asking for 2 replacement bolts. Truck job coming next week, he explained. Need to keep the shop open until then. The store owner handed him the parts. No rush, he said. Redwood Hollow did not become generous overnight. Fear still existed. The factory still stood empty at the edge of town. Unemployment checks still arrived late. But something had begun moving beneath the surface. Trust. Small. Fragile. But growing. Like roots pushing slowly through soil after winter. Not everyone welcomed the change. Scarcity creates different responses in different people. For some, generosity feels like survival. For others, it feels like risk. 3 days after the diner chalkboard appeared the town council held an emergency meeting. Most of Redwood Hollow attended. Word spread quickly when money became the topic. Councilman Edgar Tate stood at the front of the small municipal building. He had worked at the factory longer than almost anyone. And he carried the frustration of the closure heavily. We cannot solve economic collapse with charity, he said loudly. The room murmured. People must learn discipline. We cannot create dependency. Several residents nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mara sat near the back of the room listening quietly. Tate continued. The town needs jobs. Structure. Not random acts of generosity that encourage weakness. A few people clapped. But the applause sounded uncertain. Mara did not raise her hand to argue. She simply listened. Sometimes resistance reveals the true direction of a change. When people feel threatened, it often means the pattern has already begun shifting. After the meeting, the town returned to its normal routine. But the tension lingered. Some residents withdrew again. The hardware store owner removed the credit note for a few days. The diner erased the chalkboard message temporarily. The bakery shelf still held one extra loaf. But customers now looked around cautiously before taking it. Fear had not vanished. It had simply loosened its grip slightly. Change rarely moves in a straight line. It pulses. Forward. Back. Forward again. 2 nights later, Mara closed the bakery later than usual. Inventory paperwork had grown complicated recently. Donations. Prepaid loaves. Adjusted pricing. All the small shifts required careful tracking. When she finally stepped outside, the street was nearly empty. The factory building loomed dark beyond the railroad tracks. Its tall smokestacks cut sharp silhouettes against the moonlight. Mara walked slowly along Main Street. The town felt different at night now. Quieter. But not abandoned. Lights still glowed inside several houses. The diner remained open. Someone laughed inside. A sound she had not heard often since the factory closed. As she passed the hardware store window, she noticed something unusual. Another spiral coin rested beside the cash register. Identical to the one in her tip jar. The same worn metal. The same engraved spiral tightening toward its center. She stopped walking. 2 coins now. Both appearing without explanation. She continued down the street. At the diner, she glanced inside. The waitress wiped the counter while 2 late customers finished coffee. Beside the register sat a 3rd coin. The same spiral. Mara felt a slow realization forming. These coins were not random. They were markers. Someone had placed them deliberately. The stranger. Or someone connected to him. But why? She pushed open the diner door. The bell above it rang softly. The waitress looked up. "Mara," she said. "You're out late." Mara pointed toward the register. "Where did that coin come from?" The waitress shrugged. "Been there all evening. No one brought it in. Not that I saw." Mara picked it up carefully. The metal felt warm. Just like the first one. She turned it slowly beneath the diner lights. The spiral carving seemed almost alive in the reflections. "What does it mean?" the waitress asked. Mara hesitated. "I'm not sure." But something deep in her mind already suspected the answer. Pressure moves through communities. Just like weather. And when pressure builds too tightly, something shifts. Sometimes a storm. Sometimes a person. Sometimes a single loaf of bread. The stranger stood outside when she left the diner. Leaning casually against a street lamp. He watched the empty road quietly. "You've been busy," Mara said. He shook his head. "No, the town has." She held up the spiral coin. "You're leaving these everywhere. They remind people." "Of what?" "That pressure moves." Mara stepped closer. "You talk about pressure like the town is a storm." "In some ways it is." He gestured toward the dark factory building in the distance. When the factory closed, pressure entered Redwood Hollow. Fear. Uncertainty. Scarcity. Pressure builds when people close themselves. And then something eventually breaks. Mara remembered the tense council meeting. The angry voices. The tight expressions. "You think kindness prevents that?" "No, it redirects it." Just like the storm in the mountains had turned away from the valley. She suddenly remembered the story someone had mentioned earlier that week. A ranger station in Black Ridge Valley. A storm that had mysteriously shifted direction. The stranger seemed to notice her expression. Alignment, he said quietly. That's what you're watching. Alignment of what? People. The wind moved gently along Main Street, carrying the smell of fresh bread from the bakery ovens. Communities behave like weather systems, he continued. Pressure gathers. Movement begins. And eventually balance returns. Not because someone forces it, but because someone notices where the pressure is building. Mara looked down at the coin in her hand. And that's you. The stranger smiled faintly. No, that was you. Mara did not answer the stranger immediately. She simply looked at him. The quiet street. The dark factory beyond the railroad tracks. The spiral coin resting in her palm. You're saying a loaf of bread changed the town, she said finally. No, the stranger replied. The town was already changing. He gestured toward the empty road. Pressure had been building here for weeks. Fear. Loss. Anger. All of it searching for direction. And the bread? That was the moment something moved. Mara looked toward the diner windows where the late customers still sat drinking coffee. It feels small. It always does. He turned slightly, watching the dark shape of the factory building. Large changes rarely begin large. They begin with permission. Permission. Someone showing the system a different direction. The word system lingered in the air. Redwood Hollow had never considered itself a system. Just a town. But now Mara could see what he meant. The bakery shelf. The diner chalkboard. The hardware store credit. Each action had created movement. And movement spreads. Like wind shifting across a valley. The following week the change accelerated. Not because anyone organized it. But because people had begun noticing each other again. At the grocery store a retired teacher quietly paid for a young couple's vegetables. The mechanic began fixing small engines in his garage for reduced prices. The town librarian opened the reading room earlier so unemployed workers could use the computers. None of these actions solved the factory closure. Jobs were still gone. Bills still arrived. But something else had changed. Redwood Hollow had stopped shrinking. Communities often collapse inward when fear grows. Redwood Hollow had paused that collapse. Just enough to breathe again. Councilman Tate noticed as well. But his reaction differed. 3 weeks after the bakery incident he called another council meeting. This time the room filled faster. People were curious now. Hope had entered the conversation. And hope always attracts scrutiny. Tate stood at the podium again. His voice sharper this time. We cannot pretend kindness replaces industry. No one disagreed. Redwood Hollow needs employment. Structure. Economic recovery. Several heads nodded. But generosity without discipline creates weakness. A few residents shifted in their seats. Others folded their arms. Tate continued. Businesses cannot survive if they give things away. We cannot encourage dependency. His eyes moved briefly toward Mara near the back of the room. Compassion must be measured. Or it becomes destruction. The room remained quiet. Then the grocery store owner raised his hand. No one's giving everything away. We're helping each other stay afloat. That's not weakness, someone added. That's survival. Another voice spoke from the side. The factory's gone. We either work together or we sink. The conversation grew louder. Not angry. Just divided. Two visions of survival. One focused on protection. The other on cooperation. Both logical. Both understandable. Communities under pressure often fracture along those lines. But Redwood Hollow had already begun leaning toward one side. Because of a small action. A loaf of bread shared without calculation. The spiral coins began appearing more frequently after that meeting. At first only a few people noticed. One inside the diner register. Another at the grocery counter. A third resting near the hardware store tools. Each identical. Each worn. Each engraved with the same inward spiral. No one saw who placed them. They simply appeared. Like quiet reminders. Some residents treated them as curiosities. Others ignored them entirely. But a few people began carrying them in their pockets. Not as money. As symbols. A way of remembering that pressure moves. And that people could influence its direction. One evening Mara walked along the river road outside town. She needed quiet. The council meetings had stirred emotions she hadn't expected. Hope creates tension just as easily as fear. People worry about losing what little they have. Even when generosity begins spreading. She found the stranger sitting on a fallen log near the riverbank. The water moved slowly beneath thin ice. "You're still here," she said. "For now." Mara sat beside him. "You knew the town would argue." "Yes." "Why?" "Because alignment always meets resistance." The wind moved across the frozen river. Branches creaked softly in the dark. Mara turned the spiral coin in her hand. "These coins. They're appearing everywhere." The stranger nodded. "They help people notice." "Notice what?" "That they're not powerless." She frowned. "A loaf of bread isn't power." "No, but it can redirect pressure." He pointed toward the dark town lights in the distance. Redwood Hollow had reached a breaking point. Fear was tightening. People were preparing to retreat from each other. And the bread? That changed the direction. Mara considered that. So what happens now? Now the town decides whether to keep moving that way. And if it doesn't, pressure will return. Pressure always returns. She looked toward the factory again. The empty building felt like a shadow across the valley. "Are you going to fix that too?" she asked. The stranger smiled faintly. "I don't fix anything." "Then what do you do?" "I notice. And sometimes I remind people that they're capable of changing the direction of things." Snow began falling lightly. First flakes of early winter. The river carried them away silently. "Other places are watching," the stranger said quietly. "Other towns. Other valleys. Other storms." Mara glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "The world responds when pressure moves. Communities. Forests, oceans. Mountains." She remembered the story again. The storm that had curved around a valley in the mountains. "You mean places like Black Ridge?" "Yes." "What happened there?" "Someone noticed. And a storm moved." The wind shifted gently along the riverbank. Mara watched the snow drifting into small spirals above the water. The same shape again. She had seen it everywhere recently. Coins. Snow. Bread dough rising inside the ovens. Nature already understood the pattern. People were only beginning to recognize it. They walked back toward town together. Lights glowed along Main Street. The bakery windows reflected the falling snow. Before Mara reached the door she turned back toward the stranger. But he had already disappeared into the night. Only the snow remained. Spinning quietly in the streetlight. Another spiral. Another reminder. Pressure had moved through Redwood Hollow. And something inside the town had shifted. Not solved. Not finished. But aligned. Winter arrived slowly in Redwood Hollow. The first snow remained light. Soft flakes drifting across rooftops and empty factory parking lots. The town no longer felt frozen the way it had the morning the siren failed to sound. The factory still stood silent. That had not changed. 300 jobs had not magically returned. Reality rarely reverses itself that way. But something else had begun moving. The bakery shelf still held an extra loaf every morning. Sometimes two. Occasionally none. But the habit remained. People had stopped asking where the bread came from. They simply understood. If you could give, you gave. If you needed, you took. Balance adjusted quietly each day. The diner chalkboard grew longer. Not with debt. With gratitude. The waitress began writing short messages beside the names. Covered by a neighbor. Paid forward. Shared meal. None of the notes mentioned charity. Because that word no longer felt accurate. What Redwood Hollow practiced now was cooperation. Small towns understand that concept better than cities. Cities rely on systems. Small towns rely on each other. When systems fail, cooperation becomes the only structure left. The hardware store credit policy returned quietly. This time the note on the register changed. Repairs today. Payment when possible. Tools continued moving across the counter. Bolts. Wrenches. Pipe fittings. None of them solved unemployment. But they kept roofs repaired. Trucks running. Homes warm. Sometimes stability is built from thousands of small repairs rather than one large solution. By early winter the diner had started something new. Sunday dinners. One large pot of soup. Bread from the bakery. Tables pushed together. Anyone could come. Anyone could help cook. The first Sunday only 12 people attended. The second week 20. By the third week the room filled completely. Not everyone in town participated. Some still kept distance. Fear does not disappear overnight. But the pattern had shifted. Redwood Hollow had chosen direction. And direction matters more than speed. Mara continued baking every morning. Flour shipments remained uncertain. Margins stayed narrow. But the bakery stayed open. The town had begun supporting the businesses that supported them. People purchased bread even when they could have baked it themselves. Not because they had to. Because they wanted the bakery to survive. Communities do not recover through luck. They recover through intention. The spiral coins remained scattered throughout the town. Some stayed in the diner register. Others appeared beside the bakery tip jar. One hung from a small nail inside the hardware store. No one discussed them openly anymore. But people noticed. Children traced the spiral with their fingers. Older residents carried one quietly in their pockets. Not as currency. As reminder. Pressure moves. Balance returns. And people can influence both. One evening near the end of winter Mara closed the bakery later than usual. Snow had stopped falling. The sky above Redwood Hollow looked clear and deep. Main Street glowed beneath warm streetlights. For the first time in months the town felt calm. Not prosperous. Not secure. But steady. She locked the bakery door and stepped into the cold air. The factory building still stood dark beyond the railroad tracks. But it no longer felt like a shadow across the town. Just a building. Empty. Waiting. Communities. Outlive buildings. They always have. Mara walked toward the river road again. The stranger stood there. Exactly where she expected. Looking out across the frozen water. "You're leaving," she said. "Yes." "Where?" "Where pressure gathers." She nodded slowly. You never told me your name. It wouldn't help. You helped this town. The stranger shook his head. No, you did. I only noticed. The town moved on its own. Mara held up the spiral coin. Why the spiral? He took the coin gently and turned it beneath the moonlight. Everything moves this way, he said. Storms. Oceans. Galaxies. Pressure gathers. Then releases. The spiral reflected the moon for a moment. Then the light faded. People do the same thing, he continued. When fear gathers too tightly, something eventually breaks. Unless someone notices first. And changes direction. Mara thought of the loaf of bread. The moment inside the bakery. The small decision she had not calculated. That wasn't strategy, she said. It was instinct. Yes. Instinct often sees pressure before the mind does. The wind moved gently across the river. Snow lifted briefly along the frozen surface. Another spiral formed in the drifting flakes. Then vanished. Mara looked back toward town. Lights glowed along Main Street. The bakery. The diner. The grocery store. Small places. Ordinary places. Yet the town felt stronger now than it had months earlier. Not because the problems had disappeared. Because the people had aligned. Will Redwood Hollow survive? She asked quietly. Yes. How do you know? Because the town chose to move outward instead of inward. He placed the spiral coin back into her hand. Communities collapse when fear closes them. They survive when courage opens them. Mara studied the coin. The engraved spiral looked older than the town itself. Where did these come from? They appear where they're needed. That's not an answer. The stranger smiled faintly. It's the only one that matters. He stepped away toward the dark road. Snow crunched softly beneath his boots. Wait, Mara called. What happens next? He stopped briefly. Without turning around. Next, he said, another place notices. Then he continued walking. The darkness swallowed him quickly. Mara stood alone beside the river. Holding the spiral coin. The wind drifted gently across Redwood Hollow. Carrying the quiet sounds of a town that had begun moving again. In forgotten towns where fear spreads quietly, where uncertainty tightens hands, justice does not. Shouted whispers and every act leaves an echo. You have been listening to Whispers of Reckoning. Scarcity closes hands but courage opens them, and when one hand opens others follow. Every act leaves an echo.